Welcome to Pastscapes, your place for calming journeys into the past. Tonight, we are going somewhere unlike anywhere we have ever been before. We are going to a world that forgot it had a surface. A planet so ancient, so endlessly built upon, that the ground itself became a myth, a rumor whispered between the lowest levels, where no sunlight ever reaches and no wind ever stirs. A world of 1 trillion souls stacked upon the bones of 1,000 forgotten civilizations. A world whose name, spoken quietly in the dark, carries the weight of every empire that ever rose and fell among the stars. That world is Coruscant. And tonight we are going to walk its every level. From the gleaming Senate towers that pierce the clouds, down through the buzzing mid-levels where commerce never sleeps, deeper still through the amber-lit corridors of the lower city, and finally, if you are brave enough and calm enough and quiet enough, all the way down to the very bottom, to the place they call the Underworld, to the levels so old they have no names anymore, to the buried streets and silent ruins of civilizations so ancient that even the historians have forgotten them. This is the entire story of Coruscant, the city planet, the jewel of the galaxy, the seat of power for 10,000 years of republic, and then for the cold, humming machinery of empire. It is a story of grandeur and shadow, of light that never quite reaches where it is needed most, of people who built their world so high that they lost sight of where they came from. But it is also, underneath all of that, a very quiet story, a story of stone and durasteel and the slow passage of time, of footsteps in empty corridors, of archived memories gathering dust in the deepest vaults of the Jedi Temple, of a planet city breathing in the dark, layer upon layer upon layer, dreaming of something it cannot quite remember. So settle in. Let the modern world fade away. Let your breath slow and your shoulders drop, and the weight of the day lift gently from you. And join me as we descend together into the story of the most extraordinary world the galaxy ever built. There is a question that children on Coruscant sometimes ask, in the way that children ask the questions adults have long since stopped thinking about. They ask, where does the city end? And the adults, busy, distracted, hurrying between one tower and the next, usually give the same answer. They wave their hand vaguely downward. They say, it doesn't. And then they move on, because there are transports to catch and meetings to attend and 10,000 other urgent things pressing in from all sides. But the children, if they are the right kind of children, are not satisfied with that answer. Because it cannot be true, can it? Everything ends somewhere. Even the longest river finds the sea. Even the tallest mountain finds the sky. Something, somewhere beneath all those towers and tunnels and levels and sublevels must be the ground, the real ground, the original surface of the planet, the place where, if you went back far enough, the very first people who ever came to this world set their feet down and looked around and said, here, we will build here. And they were right. That place does exist. It is just that no one alive has ever seen it. Coruscant is, by almost any measure, the most urbanized world in the known galaxy. It is a planet, a full, spinning, orbiting planet roughly the size of Earth that has been so completely covered in city that the natural surface has been buried under hundreds and in some places thousands of meters of accumulated civilization, layer upon layer upon layer of streets and buildings and transit systems and power conduits and water pipes and waste tunnels and data lines built up over the course of not centuries but millennia. Over so many thousands of years that the layers at the bottom have become geological. They have become, in a very real sense, a kind of manufactured bedrock, a stratum of human and alien making compressed by the weight of everything above it into something as hard and as permanent as stone. The city is called, in the oldest records, Galactic City, though most people simply call it Coruscant, using the planet's name and the city's name interchangeably, because at some point, no one is quite sure when, those two things became the same thing. That moment, the moment when the last patch of natural ground disappeared beneath the expanding city, is one of the most debated questions in Coruscant's long history. Scholars have argued about it for centuries. Some say it happened roughly 5,000 years before the height of the Galactic Republic, during a period of explosive population growth when millions of new settlers arrived from the outer systems. Others place it earlier, much earlier, during an era so remote that it predates reliable historical records altogether. But most historians, when pressed, will say something like this: it did not happen all at once. There was no single day, no single moment when someone laid the last durasteel panel over the last square meter of natural rock and the planet became entirely artificial. It happened the way all great slow catastrophes happen, gradually, then suddenly, and then irreversibly. District by district, continent by continent, one building becoming a neighborhood becoming a sector becoming a sprawling megalopolis that swallowed the horizon. Picture it, if you can, from above. You are looking down at a planet from space. At first, in the very beginning, in the era we might call the First Age of Coruscant, you can see it is a world like any other. There are oceans, there are mountain ranges, there are great river systems threading through lowland plains, and vast forests, and the pale brown and red of desert plateaus at the poles. There is weather, real weather, not the managed industrial weather of later centuries, but the raw, unscheduled kind. Storms that build for days and break without warning, fogs that roll in off the oceans and swallow entire valleys. The first settlements are small, clusters of light visible at night on the dark side of the planet, scattered like embers across a floor of black. Each one is a city or a town or a trading post built at the junction of two rivers or at the natural harbor of a protected bay. They are, in those early days, quite ordinary, different in their architecture and their culture, perhaps, as the peoples of different planets always are, but ordinary in their smallness, their separation from one another, their dependence on the land around them. Then, slowly, something begins to change. The clusters of light begin to grow. They spread outward along coastlines and river valleys. They find each other, these growing cities, and where they meet, they do not stop. They merge, pressing together until the space between them disappears, and what was once two cities becomes one vast, seamless sprawl. The forests retreat. The rivers are channeled underground, routed through enormous tunnels of durasteel and permacrete, made to flow in straight lines and scheduled intervals rather than in the patient, wandering curves that nature preferred. The oceans are last to go. For thousands of years, even as the land surface fills completely, the oceans remain. They are an obstacle and a resource and a kind of memory, the last place on the planet where something truly natural persists. Ships move across them. Fishing communities live along their shores. The storms that brew above them are among the only storms left on the planet that has otherwise learned to manage its own weather. But the pressure is relentless. The population grows. The demand for space grows with it. And gradually, inexorably, the oceans too begin to shrink. Platforms are built over them, vast floating platforms that eventually become permanent structures, that eventually sink pylons down to the ocean floor and become effectively more city, more level, more layer. By the time the Republic reaches its height, there are no oceans anymore. There is no exposed surface. There is only the city, Galactic City, Coruscant, stretching from pole to pole and horizon to horizon in every direction, a seamless skin of durasteel and transparasteel and neon and shadow, breathing its own recycled air, drinking its own recycled water, a world entirely of its own making. From space, at night, it is breathtaking. The entire planet glows. Not with the scattered organic light of a natural world going about its business, but with the dense, continuous radiance of 1 trillion lives and their 10 trillion machines, all burning at once. Seen from a starship dropping out of hyperspace into the Coruscant system, it looks, for a disorienting moment, like a second star, like the planet itself has caught fire. Some of the old pilots, the ones who have been flying the Coruscant run for decades, say it never gets less beautiful. That no matter how many times you make that drop out of hyperspace and see that light filling the view screen, there is still something that catches in the chest. Something that says, this is where everything is. This is the center. And in a very practical sense, that is true. Coruscant sits at the intersection of major hyperspace lanes. It is positioned, almost impossibly conveniently, at a kind of galactic crossroads, a point from which the major systems of the galaxy are roughly equidistant. This geographic fact, more than anything else, is what made Coruscant inevitable. A planet at a crossroads becomes a trading post. A trading post becomes a city. A city, if it is patient enough and lucky enough, becomes a capital. Coruscant became all of those things, and then it became something more than any of those things. It became, over the long centuries of the Republic, the symbol of civilization itself, the place that all roads led to, the place where decisions were made that rippled out across 100,000 star systems, the place where history, in a very real sense, was manufactured. But here, in this first chapter, in this first quiet moment of our long descent, let us stay with the simpler thing. Let us stay with the image of that first city, in those first centuries, before the weight of history pressed down too hard. Imagine standing on a hillside, a real hillside, with real grass bending in a real wind, in an era when such things existed on this world. The sky above is the deep purple blue of early evening. Two of Coruscant's moons are visible on the horizon. The air smells of ocean and rain and something resinous like the trees that grow in the valley below. And in the valley, the city begins. It is not yet a monster. It is not yet a machine. It is just a city. Just a place where people came together because the living was easier in company than alone. Its windows are beginning to glow, one by one as the evening deepens. Somewhere in it, someone is cooking a meal. Somewhere, a child is asking a question that the adults cannot quite answer. The hill you are standing on will be gone in a few thousand years. The grass beneath your feet will be paved over, built over, buried. The wind that is moving your hair will be redirected through climate control vents. The smell of the ocean will be replaced by the smell of fuel and recycled air and 100 million meals cooking at once. But right now, in this moment, before all of that, it is just a hill. And the city below is just a city. And somewhere beneath all the thousands of years that are about to accumulate above it, that hill is still there, that original rock, that first ground, waiting in the dark. Remember that. It will matter later. Because as we go deeper into the story of Coruscant, as we descend through its gilded Senate halls and its humming mid-levels and its shadowed underworld, it is worth holding on to the thought that beneath all of it, somewhere impossibly far down, the real world is still there. Quiet, patient, waiting for someone to find it again. But if the surface of this world was buried so completely that it became a legend, then what grew up in its place? What kind of civilization could flourish on a foundation of pure human making? To understand that, we need to look up. We need to look at the towers. Let us begin with a sound. Not a dramatic sound, not a fanfare or a thunderclap, just the sound that Coruscant makes at dawn, in the upper levels, in the quiet hour before the city's traffic reaches its daytime roar. It is a low, continuous hum, not mechanical exactly, or rather not only mechanical. It is the sound of 1 trillion beings going about their lives, the murmur of 10 million repulsor lifts idling in their bays, the distant percussion of construction droids working on some new tower somewhere on the horizon, the whisper of air being processed through filters the size of buildings. Beneath all of that, if you listen carefully, there is something that sounds almost biological, a kind of breathing, a rhythmic rise and fall, as though the city itself is alive and asleep and beginning slowly to wake. The Galactic Senate building is already awake. It sits at the heart of the Senate district, which sits at the heart of Coruscant, like a thought that the planet has been trying to express for 10,000 years. It is an enormous structure, round and domed and ringed with columns, built in a style that deliberately invokes age and permanence. The architects who designed it and redesigned it again across the centuries, as each new era added its own additions and renovations, were always trying to say the same thing with its stones and its proportions. This has always been here. This will always be here.
From a distance, in the early light, it has a certain quiet authority. The dome catches the first rays of Coruscant's sun, a sun that appears from the surface somewhat smaller and paler than you might expect, filtered as it is through layers of smog and atmosphere and the visual noise of a billion competing light sources. But in that first hour of morning, before the smog thickens, the light can be golden, and against that gold the Senate dome rises pale and confident, surrounded by the towers of the government district, like a patriarch surrounded by grown children. The Galactic Republic, the political entity that claimed Coruscant as its capital, was at its height one of the largest governing bodies in recorded history. It encompassed somewhere between 10,000 and 25,000 member worlds, depending on how you count the associate members and the protectorates, and the regions under special administration. It had been in existence in one form or another for roughly 25,000 years by the time of its fall. It had outlasted empires, survived wars, absorbed and reformed and reconstituted itself so many times that historians sometimes struggle to say with confidence what exactly the Republic was at any given moment in its long history. But Coruscant was always there. The capital changed names. Sometimes it was called the Core Worlds Compact, sometimes the Galactic Concordance, sometimes simply the Senate. But the location never changed. Whatever the Republic called itself in any century, it met on Coruscant. It argued on Coruscant. It made its laws and broke them and remade them on Coruscant. There is something remarkable about that kind of continuity. 25,000 years of returning to the same place, of generation after generation of senators and diplomats and aide-de-camps arriving at the same spaceport, looking up at the same dome, walking through the same enormous entrance hall with its polished floors that have been walked upon so many times they carry a kind of shine that no cleaning droid could produce. The shine of feet, of 10,000 feet. The Senate District in the era of the late Republic, the era that most people think of when they imagine Coruscant, is a place of extraordinary density and extraordinary contrast. Walk down its main boulevard on any given afternoon, and you will see representatives of 100 different species in 100 different styles of dress. You will hear a dozen languages spoken simultaneously, the babble of translation units almost keeping pace. You will smell 100 different foods from the vendor carts that cluster along the edge of the plaza, each one catering to a different biochemistry, a different palate, a different idea of what constitutes a meal. The buildings around the Senate are the government buildings, the ministries, the diplomatic residences, elaborate fortress-like structures where ambassadors from distant systems live in self-contained bubbles of their homeworld's atmosphere and culture. The administrative towers, which run straight up into the sky in the clean, severe lines that the late Republic favored for its official architecture, a style that said efficiency and order without quite saying warmth. Inside the Senate building itself, the scale is staggering. The central chamber, the Galactic Senate Chamber, is a space so large that it has its own weather patterns. Not dramatic weather, not storms or rain, but thermal gradients, subtle pressure variations, the slight but measurable difference between the air at the bottom of the chamber and the air at the top. It is a roughly circular space, tiered, with the central platform at the bottom and the gallery seats rising around it in concentric rings that seem, from certain angles, to go on forever. There are 1,024 senatorial pods in the full chamber. Each one is a kind of hovering platform that can extend out over the chamber floor during debate, carrying the senator and their delegation out into the shared space where they can be seen and heard by all. When all the pods are deployed at once, which happens only on the most significant occasions, the chamber becomes a kind of forest of floating platforms, each one carrying its own small world. The acoustic design of the chamber is a miracle of engineering. Even without amplification, a voice speaking from the central platform can be heard clearly in the highest gallery. The architects achieved this through a combination of the chamber's geometry and a series of subtle sound-channeling surfaces built into the walls, surfaces that look to the untrained eye like decorative relief carvings, but are in fact precisely calculated acoustic panels. Senators who are new to the chamber sometimes freeze when they first speak in it. The sound of their own voice coming back to them from all sides, amplified, clarified, stripped of the usual soft interference of a normal room, is disorienting. It is as if the chamber is listening very, very carefully, as if every word you say here matters more than words said elsewhere. Perhaps that is the point. Outside the Senate chamber itself, the building spreads through corridors and committee rooms and dining halls and private offices in a maze that takes most new arrivals weeks to navigate. There are said to be rooms in the Senate building that have not been officially visited in decades. Committee spaces set aside for subcommittees of subcommittees, their doors coded to senators who retired generations ago. Archivists periodically sweep through these forgotten rooms, cataloging what is left behind. The findings are sometimes extraordinary. Records from eras so distant that their script requires specialist translation, furniture in styles that no one manufactures anymore, and sometimes stranger things, evidence of decisions made and then deliberately buried, of votes taken in rooms with no witness. The Senate has always had its shadows. Even in its golden age, and people who study the Republic are quick to point out that its golden age was not quite as golden as the monuments suggest, it was an institution that ran on compromise and negotiation, and quite frequently on the quiet management of inconvenient truths. The corruption that eventually helped bring the Republic down was not something that appeared suddenly. It accumulated, layer by layer, like the city itself. Each generation adding its own small deposit of compromise and avoidance until the weight became unsupportable. But let us not go there yet. Let us stay for a moment in the early morning light on the Senate steps. The plaza is filling now. Diplomatic speeders are arriving and departing in the upper traffic lanes, long formal vehicles in the colors of their home systems, each one carrying its own small delegation, its own set of concerns, its own version of the galaxy's problems translated into the language of policy. On the plaza level, citizens of Coruscant are crossing on their way to offices and shops and the thousand small errands of daily life. A tour group of school-aged children from some outer system world, eyes wide, heads tilted back to take in the scale of the dome, is being shepherded by an overwhelmed teacher toward the public gallery entrance. For the children from the outer systems, this is often the first time they have seen the center. The first time the Republic has been a physical reality rather than an abstraction, a name on official documents or a voice on the holonet. They stand on the plaza and look up at the dome and understand, perhaps for the first time, what it means to be part of something this large. It is a feeling worth sitting with, the feeling of standing at the center of something vast, of knowing that in this place, at this moment, decisions are being made about the shape of the galaxy. That the civilization these children were born into, with its hyperspace lanes and its shared language and its promise, however imperfect, of some common law, has its heart here, beating steadily in the morning light. For a moment it feels safe, it feels permanent, but things that feel permanent are only things that haven't fallen yet. And beneath the gleaming Senate, beneath the polished plaza and the diplomatic residences and the government towers, there was another kind of power gathering, older, quieter, and far more watchful. To find it, you had to look toward the temple.
Past the security checkpoints, which are more elaborate in the later years of the Republic, the guards a little more tense, the scanners a little more thorough, past the great entrance hall with its rows of banners representing the member worlds, an enormous catalog of colors and sigils that stretches the full length of the hall and still cannot quite hold them all. Past the information kiosks, where junior aides are already hurrying with data pads tucked under their arms, already late for the first briefings of the day. The interior of the Senate building smells of a very particular combination of things. Old stone, or rather, old permacrete treated to look and feel like stone, because even the Senate cannot escape the practicalities of the city it sits in, and polished metal. And faintly always, the mineral tang of recycled air passing through filters of exceptional quality. The Senate building has its own dedicated air processing. The senators, understandably, prefer not to breathe exactly the same air as the lower levels. And something else beneath all of that, something that is harder to name.
The smell of documents, perhaps, of decisions, of the specific variety of human anxiety that produces negotiation and compromise and the careful selection of words. A serious smell, a place of consequence smell. The corridors are wide enough that two delegations can pass each other without disrupting anyone's sense of personal space or diplomatic dignity, a consideration that was literally written into the building's design specifications. The floors are the same pale, faintly reflective material throughout, with borders of darker stone marking the edges of each corridor, and at the intersections, small inlaid mosaics in the shapes of the Republic's symbol. A stylized starburst, radiating outward in all directions. Committee rooms line both sides of the main corridors. Some are small, intimate almost by Senate standards. A round table, 8 or 10 chairs, a hollow projector in the center, windows that look onto an interior courtyard rather than the exterior of the building. These are the rooms where the real work gets done, where the language of proposed legislation gets negotiated word by word, where voting blocks are assembled and disassembled over cold cups of caf in the early hours of the morning, where the decisions that will later be announced in the grand chamber are actually made, quietly, without ceremony. Observe for a moment one of these committee sessions in progress. The room is neither large nor small. Around the table sit 9 beings of 5 different species, all of them either senators or senior aides. The hollow projector in the center of the table is displaying a map of the mid-rim, a region experiencing, at this particular moment in the Republic's history, a complex dispute over trade routes and taxation policy that has been running for 11 years. The dispute involves 6 different planets, 4 major shipping corporations, 2 smaller guilds, and a border disagreement that predates the Republic's current charter. The senator from Malastare is speaking. He is a Gron, 3 eyes set on stalks above a broad face, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who has been in politics long enough to have lost all impatience with process. He is explaining, for what appears to be the 4th or 5th time this session, why the proposed amendment to the current resolution is inadequate. His tone is patient. His eyes are tired. Across the table, the Twi'lek aide from the Ryloth delegation is making quiet notes on a datapad. She does not look up while the senator speaks. She has been making notes for 3 hours. The notes are extraordinarily detailed. They will form the basis of the counterproposal that the Ryloth delegation will introduce tomorrow morning at the session that will bring the other 5 delegations into the largest committee room on this floor. This is how the Republic works. Not in grand speeches in the full chamber, though those happen and they matter, but in rooms like this. In careful, exhausting conversations between tired people who have been arguing about the same problem for years and know they will be arguing about it for years more. In the patient accumulation of language, the adding and removing of single words from proposed resolutions, the bracketing of clauses, the slow architectural work of building something that enough different kinds of people can accept. It is not romantic. It is very far from romantic. But there is something almost beautiful about it seen in the right light. The sheer human and non-human persistence of it. The willingness, generation after generation, to keep sitting down at the table, to keep trying to find the form of words that might hold. The Grand Chamber, when it is in full session, is something else entirely. On the days when major legislation is being debated, or when a crisis has erupted somewhere in the galaxy and the Senate must decide how to respond, the chamber is packed. Every pod is occupied. Every gallery seat is taken. The hum of 1,000 different species breathing the same recycled air, of 1,000 different translation units running simultaneously, of the barely suppressed noise of 10,000 opinions all straining toward expression. It fills the space like weather. The central platform, suspended in the middle of all of this, belongs to the Supreme Chancellor. This is the single most powerful public speaking position in the galaxy. A small circle of floor, ringed by a low railing, above which the full chamber rises in its concentric rings of occupied pods. A speaker standing there can see almost every face in the chamber, and every face in the chamber can see them. The supreme chancellors of the late Republic, and particularly the one who would become the last of them, were masters of this space. They understood that a voice launched from that central platform would carry differently depending on its tone, that a measured, calm voice created a kind of intimacy even in a space this large, that a voice edged with barely controlled urgency could make 1,000 senators feel as though they were personally, individually responsible for whatever crisis was being described. It was a skill that required years to develop and was almost impossible to fake. There were sessions, in the later years of the Republic, when the chamber became something close to a theater, when the debate on the floor was, at least in part, a performance, its real purpose not to deliberate, but to demonstrate, to display the appearance of a functioning democratic process while the actual decisions had already been made elsewhere. There were senators who knew this and said so loudly from their deployed pods. There were senators who suspected it but said nothing. And there were senators who believed entirely in the process, who came to the chamber each day with their carefully prepared arguments and their faith in the system, and who would not understand for years, if they ever understood at all, that the ground beneath the system had already shifted. But the chamber also had its genuine moments. There was a session, about a decade before the fall of the Republic, in a junior senator from a small, obscure mid-rim system stood on the central platform and delivered a speech that, by every account of the people who were there, held the entire chamber still. She was speaking about the condition of her people, about what the long neglect of the outer systems felt like from the inside, about the gap between the promises of the Republic and the daily reality of worlds that rarely appeared on the HoloNet unless something catastrophic had happened there. She spoke quietly. She had no theatrical training. She had been a senator for only 2 years. When she finished, the chamber was silent for a long moment, and then, not all of them, not even most of them, but enough of them that people remembered it afterward, senators began to applaud. Not the polite, professional kind of applause that the chamber produced at the end of official ceremonies, something more reluctant, more real. She sat down in her pod. She was shaking slightly, though she tried not to show it. Around her, her small delegation of 3 aides was very still. Nothing changed immediately. The legislation she had been advocating for was delayed for another 4 years. The situation on her home system did not improve and in some ways worsened before it was finally addressed, but people remembered the speech. They talked about it in corridors and committee rooms for years afterward. They referenced it in other speeches. A recording of it survived and was periodically replayed in the public archives. Perhaps that is all any individual voice in a space that large can hope to accomplish, to be remembered, to shift, however slightly, the quality of the silence that comes after. The Senate building at night is a different kind of place. Most of the committees have wrapped. The grand chamber is empty, its thousands of seats dark, its central platform vacant, the air in it slowly cooling now that it doesn't have to work as hard. Security droids make their silent rounds. A maintenance crew works in one of the outer corridors, replacing a section of floor that is finally worn through after a century of use. In the upper floors, where the administrative offices are, a few lights are still burning. There is always a few lights burning in the Senate building. There is always something urgent enough to keep someone at their desk past midnight. A crisis somewhere in the outer rim, a vote that needs to happen at dawn and lacks a crucial 3% of the needed support. A document that must be filed by morning or a trade agreement lapses. In those quiet upper offices, in the small hours of the night, the Senate feels most itself, stripped of ceremony and audience and the performing of grandeur. Just a building, just some exhausted people, just the ongoing patient work of trying to hold something enormous together with language and compromise and the slow, difficult tool of law. Outside the window, the city hums on. It never stops, not for night, not for storms, not for the grinding passage of centuries. The city beneath the Senate is awake, always, in its mid-levels and its lower corridors and its deepest lightless underways. Something is always moving. Someone is always awake. And And while the Senate debated and deliberated and made and broke its promises above, another institution kept a much longer, much quieter vigil. An institution that had watched over this world for so many thousands of years that it had become almost indistinguishable from the sky. Almost, but not quite.
There is a place in the Senate district, not far from the Great Dome, perhaps a few kilometers to the northwest, if northwest means anything on a planet without north, where the skyline changes character. The buildings in that direction are still tall, still the polished, severe towers of the government quarter, still the functional grandeur of an institution that takes its role in history seriously. But among them, rising above them and somehow separate from them, even in the middle of everything, there is a complex of buildings that draws the eye in a different way. 5 towers. That is the first thing most people notice from a distance. 5 towers arranged around a central spire, each one tapering as it rises, each one capped with a distinctive architectural feature that resembles, depending on who you ask, either a crown or an open hand. The towers are made of a pale stone, real stone, not permacrete, quarried from a source so old that even the Jedi archivists were not entirely certain where the original blocks came from. The color of the stone changes through the day, white in the morning light, gold in the afternoon, and something closer to gray-blue in the evening when the smog of the city catches the last of the sun. This is the Jedi Temple. It has stood on this particular piece of Coruscant for approximately 4,000 years. Before that, because the temple, like everything on Coruscant, has layers, there was a different structure on the same site. Before that, according to the oldest records, the site was considered significant even before any temple was built there. A place where something could be felt by those sensitive enough to feel it, where the Force moved in a way that was slightly different from everywhere else. Slightly, not dramatically. The Jedi, historically, were suspicious of drama. The temple complex, at its height during the later years of the Republic, is a city within a city. From above, it covers several square kilometers. The main temple building with its 5 towers, the training courts that extend behind it, the gardens, which are perhaps the only extensive gardens left in this part of Coruscant, the dormitories and classrooms and medical facilities that support a community of several thousand. And beneath all of this, connected to the temple by a system of internal passages that descend through level after level of the complex, the Jedi archives. Come through the main entrance. The great doors are not locked during daylight hours. They are rarely locked at any hour. The Jedi, as an institution, tended toward openness of a certain kind. The entrance hall is vast and dim, lit by indirect light sources set high in the walls and in the ceiling, which rises nearly 30 meters from the floor. The walls are carved reliefs depicting moments from Jedi history, not battle scenes predominantly, though battles appear. Mostly, the reliefs show Jedi in states of contemplation, standing alone, sitting in circles, looking at things that the reliefs suggest but don't quite show. The floors are polished stone, smooth from generations of footsteps. The air is cooler here than outside. The temple's environmental systems maintain a specific temperature and humidity that is, for reasons the Jedi have articulated differently in different eras, considered most conducive to clarity. Not cold, just cool enough to wake you up slightly, to bring you into yourself. At the center of the entrance hall, there is no monument, no statue of a great historical Jedi, no altar, just a circular space, slightly sunken below the level of the surrounding floor, in which nothing has been placed. It is empty intentionally, an empty center, a space held open. The Jedi have a word for it, a word in one of the old languages that roughly translates as the readiness that precedes knowing. The corridors of the temple are wide and high-ceilinged, lined with doors that open onto training rooms, meditation chambers, classrooms where the youngest students, the initiates in Jedi terminology, learn the basic principles of what they are.
The sound of the temple in the morning when training is underway is a combination of quiet voices and the occasional resonant snap hiss of a training lightsaber muffled by the thick walls. It is a sound that, once heard, is difficult to forget. Something about it, the particular frequency of it, or perhaps the association it carries, gives the impression of absolute focus, of attention brought fully to bear on a single point. The Jedi Order, at its height in the late Republic, numbered in the tens of thousands, but the temple itself housed a much smaller community, perhaps 5 to 10,000, including students, masters, and the various non-Jedi staff who kept the complex running. Most Jedi were out in the galaxy, on assignment, working in the diplomatic service, in the field, in the peacekeeping operations that the Order undertook on behalf of the Senate. The temple was the anchor, the home base, the place to which Jedi returned between assignments and from which they received new ones. The Jedi High Council met in one of the 5 towers, the one closest to the center. The council chamber was a circular room at the top of the tower, ringed with windows that looked out over the city in all directions. On a clear day, and clear days on Coruscant were rarer than they had been in earlier centuries, but still came, you could see to the horizon in all 4 directions from those windows, an unbroken panorama of the city that made the scale of Coruscant suddenly viscerally real.
The 12 seats of the High Council were arranged in a circle matching the room itself. There was no head of the table. There was no position that suggested precedence over any other. The architectural choice was deliberate. In the council, all voices carried equally, at least in principle. In practice, some voices carried more weight. The Jedi Masters who held the positions of greatest experience and most nuanced understanding of the Force, or who were simply the most persuasive, shaped the direction of the Order's decisions in ways that the circular seating could not entirely conceal. But the aspiration remained. The empty center of the circle, like the empty center of the entrance hall below, held open the possibility of something not yet decided. The Jedi Archives. These are worth a chapter on their own, but let us begin them here because they are, in many ways, the heart of the temple in a way that even the council chamber is not. They occupy multiple levels beneath the main temple building, descending through the complex in a series of great, long halls connected by ramps and lifts. The main hall is among the most beautiful spaces on all of Coruscant, a corridor that stretches, it seems, for hundreds of meters, lined on both sides with rows of archive terminals and cases holding holographic records, with busts of Jedi Masters from across the millennia placed at regular intervals in alcoves carved into the walls, their faces calm and attentive in the amber light. The light in the archives is always amber, not the white light of the temple corridors above, something warmer, older feeling, as though the light itself has been here long enough to acquire a patina. Chief Librarian Jocasta Nu, in the later years of the Republic, presided over the archives with an authority that even the most senior Jedi Masters tended to approach carefully. She was, by all accounts, an extraordinary scholar, sharp-minded, encyclopedic in her knowledge, and possessed of a very particular quality that long-serving archivists sometimes develop, the conviction that information, properly organized and properly preserved, was the foundation of everything else, that all the diplomacy and peacekeeping and force-wielding in the world was ultimately downstream of knowledge, of knowing what had happened before. If it is not in the archives, she was known to say, in a tone that brooked very little further discussion, it does not exist. This was, of course, not true. There were things in the galaxy that were not in the archives, things that had been removed, deliberately or accidentally, things that had never been recorded, things that predated the archives by so much that no record had survived. This was a vulnerability that was not fully understood until it was too late. But set that aside for now. Sit for a moment in the archive reading room. It is late in the afternoon, the amber light unchanged from how it looked this morning and how it looked 100 years ago. A Jedi Padawan, perhaps 15 years old, studying for some assignment, is bent over a terminal at one of the long reading tables, her face lit by the blue glow of the holographic text scrolling past. Her master is somewhere else in the temple. She is alone, surrounded by the quiet company of 10,000 years of stored knowledge. Outside, 10 levels above, the city is a roar. Traffic, construction, the ceaseless commerce of a galactic capital. Down here, none of it reaches. The walls of the temple, those thick old stone of pale quarried stone, absorb the sound completely. The silence in the archive reading room is real silence, not the artificial silence of a sealed room, but the earned silence of a place where many people over many years have come to think. The Padawan turns a page. The holographic text reforms itself into a new configuration, a map of a sector she has never visited, depicting events that happened 800 years before she was born. She does not know it yet, but the knowledge she is accumulating in rooms like this one will matter. Not in the way she expects, perhaps, not in the form of a single decisive memory retrieved at the moment of need, like a key turning a lock, but in a slower, deeper way, the way that knowing the shape of the past gives you sometimes a small and imperfect understanding of the shape of what might be coming. And the temple kept its vigil through the long years of the Republic's golden age and the shadow years that came after. Those 5 towers rose above the city, watching. But below the temple, below the Senate, below the government district and the gleaming upper levels, another kind of city was living and breathing in the dark. To find it, we need to go down.
The elevator descends. You step into it from the upper city, from the bright, busy, vertigo-inducing open air of the Senate District's surface level, where speeders arc through canyons of tower glass, and the sky is a strip of pale color glimpsed between buildings. The elevator doors close. The level indicator begins to count down. The higher levels are numbered in the strange inverse logic of Coruscant's geography from the top. Level 1 is the highest point, the very peaks of the tallest towers, where the air is thin and cold, and the planet's surface is so far below that it is theoretically measurably closer to the stars than to the ground. Level 5000 is, roughly, where the lower city begins. And level 1313, the level that gives this chapter its name, is somewhere in the vast middle space between the gleaming upper world and the true underworld. Somewhere in the amber zone where things begin to get interesting. The elevator passes through several thresholds as it descends. The first threshold is light. In the upper levels, the light is immediate and direct, sunlight supplemented by the massive artificial lighting systems of the upper city, creating a brightness that is almost relentless. As the elevator descends, the sunlight disappears first. There are no external windows at this point. The surrounding buildings are too dense, too close, pressing in from all sides. But the artificial light continues for several levels more. Bright white light from ceiling panels in the transit corridors, the sharp blue-white light of commercial lighting in the shopping and restaurant levels, the cheerful glow of residential floors. Then, gradually, the quality of the light changes. It becomes yellower, warmer in color, but somehow less generous, spread thinner, as though the system that produces it has been retrofitted and expanded and retrofitted again over centuries of incremental maintenance, until the original design is buried under layers of pragmatic improvisation. The yellow light of the mid-levels is the light of places that were designed for function rather than beauty, and have been serving that function without complaint for a very long time. The second threshold is sound. The upper city is loud in a specific forward-leaning way, the sound of commerce and movement and the relentless forward momentum of a galactic capital. As you descend, that particular frequency of urgency fades. What replaces it is a different kind of sound, denser, more layered, more textured. The sound of machinery that has been running so long it has become part of the ambient environment, indistinguishable from silence to the people who live near it. The low pulse of the power distribution networks, the distant rhythmic percussion of the city's atmospheric processing systems, and over all of this, the ordinary sounds of the mid-level population. Voices in a dozen languages, the clatter of a market, the mechanical music of a vendor's call, the occasional sharp report of something being repaired or something going wrong. The third threshold is smell. This is perhaps the most visceral. The upper city, with its superior ventilation and its wealthy residents' willingness to pay for filtered air, has an almost aggressive cleanliness of smell. Faint recycled air mineral tang, the controlled drift of food smells from high-end restaurants, the occasional cold clean of a climate system working perfectly. As you descend, the smell deepens. It becomes more present, more honest in its way. The smell of a city that cannot hide what it is. Cooking smells from 100 different cuisines, industrial lubricant, damp concrete, the particular complex smell of bodies and machines and organic waste and recycled water, and the indefinable accumulation of lives lived at close quarters over a very long time. By the time you reach 1313, the smell has become a physical presence, a companion, something you adjust to rather than something you escape. Level 1313 is famous in the city's internal mythology as the boundary level, the point at which the city transitions from merely complicated to genuinely opaque. Above 1313, the city has the forms of legibility, maps that roughly correspond to reality, addresses that more or less exist, businesses that are nominally registered with some kind of governmental authority. Below 1313, the usual systems of governance and record-keeping become suggestions rather than realities. They are still technically present. The Republic always maintained, on paper, jurisdiction over every level of Coruscant down to the lowest, but the practical exercise of that jurisdiction grew more theoretical the further down you went. The level is a large open concourse, or rather it is several large open concourses connected by bridges and tunnels and the occasional dramatic atrium that drops away beneath your feet for 10 or 20 additional levels, so that looking down is briefly vertigo-inducing even in the middle of the city. The ceiling height in the main concourses is perhaps 20 meters, with the structural elements of the levels above visible as a kind of architectural sky, durasteel beams and conduit runs and the underside of platform surfaces, all of it lit by a combination of installed lighting fixtures and the ambient glow of the businesses themselves.
The businesses at level 1313 are a particular category of enterprise, not quite legitimate, not quite illegitimate, operating in the specific cultural space that exists between those two conditions, a space that has its own customs and courtesies and social codes. There are bars that serve species from across the galaxy, their lighting calibrated to make everyone look slightly better than they feel. There are mechanics shops where the workers are among the best in the city, because at this level reputation travels quickly and bad work gets remembered. There are food vendors and equipment dealers and information brokers who do not technically advertise the information broker aspect of their business. There are also, less visibly, other things. At level 1313, the cartography of who owns what, and who owes what, and who is watching whom becomes considerably more complex. Criminal organizations maintain a presence here, not openly, but woven into the legitimate businesses like threads of a different color in an otherwise uniform fabric. Most residents of the level are aware of this. Most of them navigate around it with the practiced ease of people who have lived near something dangerous for so long that it has become simply another feature of the landscape. The people of level 1313 are, as a population, among the most practically capable on all of Coruscant. They have to be. The systems that smooth life in the upper levels, reliable public services, responsive maintenance, the assurance that if something breaks, someone official will come to fix it, are present here only in attenuated form. Things that break at level 1313 tend to get fixed by whoever is nearest, using whatever is available. The culture this produces is a culture of improvisation and self-reliance. People who can fix things, build things, find things, know people who know things. There is a workshop on the main concourse, has been there in one form or another for centuries, passed from owner to owner in a succession that is not quite inheritance and not quite sale, but something more informal, where the current proprietor builds and repairs droids of every type and vintage. She is a Basilis, a four-armed species that tends toward the mechanical arts, and her workshop is a testament to the aesthetic that Level 1313 has made its own. Functional, dense, layered with the evidence of previous iterations, every surface covered with components in various states of disassembly, every tool with a history, every droid in the shop carrying visible marks of previous repair, previous owners, previous lives. She is working, as we pass, on a protocol droid that has seen better decades. Its chassis is a patchwork of panels from at least 4 different manufacturing eras, held together with connections that should not technically work as well as they do. She is humming something, a low, tuneless sound, not quite music, more like the noise a satisfied mind makes when it is working on something it understands completely. The droid watches her work with its photoreceptors. It has been conscious, in the particular limited way that protocol droids are conscious, for longer than it can cleanly track. It has served at different times in a senatorial office, a merchant ship, 2 private households, and 1 establishment at Level 1313 that it has chosen, in its internal filing system, to not categorize precisely. Its memory is full of languages, 46 million forms of communication, as the specification claims, though in practice it operates most fluently in about 2,000. It does not exactly know what it feels about the workshop, about the woman repairing it, about the particular quality of amber light at Level 1313. But if it could be said to feel anything, it would be something in the vicinity of relief. The relief of being in capable hands. The relief of being in a place where things that are broken do not have to be broken. But Level 1313 is not the bottom, not even close. The bottom is far further down, so far down that it has its own name, its own mythology, its own gravity. And to find it, we need to go deeper still, much, much deeper. Listen. Not to the sounds of the city above, the familiar hum and percussion and layered roar of Coruscant's middle levels. Listen for what is underneath all of that, the sounds that exist in the spaces between the sounds. At the deepest levels of Coruscant, the levels with no official designations, or designations so old that the maps which record them are themselves centuries out of date, the city's acoustic character changes completely. The high-frequency noise of commerce and movement and machinery is swallowed by the distance and by the enormous mass of the levels above, which absorbs sound the way deep ocean water absorbs light. What remains is low frequency only, the base register of the city's infrastructure, the deep arrhythmic pulse of power systems that have been running continuously for so many centuries that the original engineers who installed them are fictional characters in the maintenance logs, names without biographical detail, referenced only as the originators of decisions that everyone since has had to live with. Down here, in the Underworld proper, the architecture changes. The upper city's architecture is about aspiration, the tall, the gleaming, the pointed towards the sky. The mid-level architecture is about efficiency, horizontal, dense, designed to contain and direct. But the deep levels architecture, to the extent that the deep levels have architecture at all, is about depth, about pressing down, about structures that have been pushed lower and lower by the weight of everything built above them, and that have responded to that pressure by becoming denser, lower ceilinged, more compressed. The corridors here are narrower. The ceiling heights are lower, sometimes so low that taller species need to hunch slightly, a physical compression that has its psychological equivalent. Even the materials look different, not the polished durasteel and transparasteel of the upper city, but older alloys, cast in molds that are no longer manufactured, carrying the specific gray-green patina of metal that has been in the presence of moisture and industrial chemicals for 1,000 years. And the light. Down here, the light is as far from sunlight as you can get. There are still light sources. The city has power running even at these depths, tapping into the vast geothermal and fusion systems that feed energy upward to the rest of Coruscant. But the lighting at the deepest levels is sparse. Deliberate gaps between fixtures, long stretches of corridor where the only light comes from the glow of indicator panels and power conduit housings and the bioluminescent species who live here and carry their own light with them.
In those dark stretches, walking through the underworld, you develop a different relationship with visibility. The darkness here is not dangerous necessarily, not always, not by itself, but it is informative. It tells you where the maintenance priorities have not reached, where the city's interest in its own lower stories has lapsed. It tells you that you are somewhere the upper world has agreed to stop thinking about. People live here. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Coruscant underworld, and the thing that is most often missed by those who encounter it only in its mythological form, as a setting for danger and crime and the worst qualities of a civilization. People live here, millions of them. They have lives, complex, specific, irreducible lives, not reducible to their address in the lower city. They include, in rough proportion, a large population of species whose sensory and physiological preferences align naturally with the low light and the specific atmospheric conditions of the deep levels. Several communities of beings who came to Coruscant generations ago and found the surface levels unaffordable or unwelcoming and settled here, building the kind of tight insular social structures that people build when they find themselves in the same narrow space with the same difficult circumstances. Skilled workers, mechanics, engineers, divers who maintain the infrastructure of the levels above, accessing systems that the upper city depends on but never thinks about. And yes, criminals, organized criminal networks, individual operators, the full spectrum of people who have found that operating outside the law is, for whatever combination of reasons, more viable than operating within it. The communities of the underworld maintain their own internal governance, not entirely without parallel to the Senate, actually, though the senators would be offended by the comparison. There are neighborhood councils. There are agreed-upon boundaries and customs. There are, in the older communities, systems of mutual support and obligation that are more functional and more practiced than anything the official social support system of the Republic provides at these depths. The Black Sun Syndicate, in the era of the late Republic, maintains significant presence in the underworld. Black Sun is one of the galaxy's oldest and most durable criminal organizations, a network that spans multiple systems and has been in continuous operation long enough to have its own institutional culture, its own traditions, its own internal hierarchy, with all the Byzantine complexity of any long-established organization. At the deep levels of Coruscant, Black Sun operates through a web of fronts and intermediaries and informal systems of taxation, calling it taxation being admittedly a charitable framing. But Black Sun is not the only power here. The underworld has its own power ecology, with overlapping territories and shifting alliances, and the occasional violent renegotiation of boundaries. For the ordinary residents of the deep levels, this ecology is simply part of the environment, something to navigate, like the low ceilings and the irregular lighting.
There are places in the underworld that have been occupied continuously for so long that the original nature of the buildings has become impossible to determine. A corridor that has been used as a market for 1,000 years was, before that, something else. A manufacturing floor, perhaps, or a transit route, or a section of what was once an exterior wall before the building on the other side was built, and the gap between them was bridged and enclosed and incorporated. The archaeology of the deep levels, for those few scholars intrepid and funded enough to pursue it, is a matter of reading these accretions layer by layer, the way a geologist reads a cliff face. One such scholar, a human woman from a university in the upper city, who had been studying the deep levels for 20 years by the time our story reaches its climax, described her work as the most humbling thing she had ever done. "You think you understand how old the city is," she said, in an interview recorded for a documentary that was eventually shelved because the documentary maker found the subject too complicated to compress into a suitable format. "You say the number, 25,000 years, 30,000 years, whatever the current estimate is. You say the number and you think you understand it, and then you go down there and you find something. A piece of wall, a section of floor, a conduit housing with an alloy composition that the materials lab cannot match to anything in the current catalog. And you understand that you don't understand, that the number is just a number. The reality is something your brain isn't built to hold." She
She had found, in the course of her research, evidence of at least 7 distinct civilizational layers at the deep levels she had studied, 7 different periods of construction and use, each one built over or into the previous, each one carrying its own material culture, its own alloys, its own joining techniques, its own aesthetic inclinations expressed in the shapes of doorways and the proportions of rooms. The oldest layers she had reached were, by conservative estimate, between 40 and 60,000 years old. What she could not determine was what had happened to the civilizations of those lower layers. She had no record of them. The archives, the Jedi archives, the Republic archives, every archive she had consulted had nothing that corresponded to the material evidence she was finding, which meant either that the records had not survived, or that they had never been made, or, and this was the possibility that she found most unsettling, that they had been deliberately removed. Cities have memories, she wrote, in a paper that was read by approximately 40 people before being catalogued and forgotten in a university archive. And cities also have systems for managing their memories, for deciding what is remembered and what is allowed to be forgotten. Coruscant has had 25,000 years of the Republic, and perhaps as many more years of whatever came before, to decide what it wants to know about itself. What I have found in the deep levels suggests that the answer is not everything, not even close to everything. She is right about that, but the full shape of what Coruscant has chosen not to know about itself is a question we will not be able to answer for some time yet. For now, stand here in the deep level corridor and listen again. There is the low pulse of the infrastructure, the distant sound of someone at work, the ring of metal on metal very far away, producing a faint resonance in the floor beneath your feet, the quiet of a city that has been quiet in this particular way for so long that the quiet itself is a kind of history. And something else, something almost imperceptible, a current of air, a real current, not the deliberate push of a climate system, something moving on its own, for reasons that have to do with pressure differentials between levels, or with the dynamics of spaces so large that they generate their own small meteorologies. The air in the deep levels moves, slowly, in long, sighing cycles that take hours to complete. It is one of the few things down here that is still, in any meaningful sense, natural, still responding to physics rather than engineering. Breathe it in. But the Underworld's darkness was not only a matter of light, it was also a matter of what gathered in that darkness, of the lives and the choices and a particular kind of freedom that exists when the law becomes a theoretical concept. That story is its own chapter entirely. There is a cantina at a level that has no official designation. The sign above its door reads simply "Below," which serves simultaneously as a name, an address, and something close to a philosophy. The cantina has been operating under various names and ownerships for approximately 800 years. The current proprietor, a Duros whose blue-gray skin and large, expressionless red eyes give him an air of perpetual mild disapproval, acquired the establishment from his predecessor in a transaction whose details neither party found it useful to specify precisely. He has been running it for 30 years. He has no plans to stop. Inside, the cantina is lit by a combination of fixtures in 3 different styles, installed across 3 different eras of the establishment's history, creating a layered illumination that leaves certain corners in careful shadow without making the overall atmosphere oppressive. The furniture is robust, designed to withstand the specific varieties of damage that occasionally occur in establishments of this type, without looking as though it has been designed with that purpose in mind. The bar itself is a long curve of laminated material that has been polished so many times it has acquired a depth, a sense of interior space, like a still body of dark water. The clientele at any given hour reflects the population of the surrounding levels. Beings from a dozen species in various states of occupation or purposeful idleness, communicating in a mixture of basic and a half-dozen other languages, and a kind of nonverbal communication that develops between people who have been navigating the same social territory together for long enough to have developed shortcuts. The noise level is calibrated, not so quiet as to feel surveilled, not so loud as to interfere with conversations that need to stay private. Conversations at below quite frequently need to stay private. This is the business of the underworld, or at least one of its primary businesses: information. The moving of it, the managing of it, the selling of it to parties who need it and cannot, or prefer not to, acquire it through legitimate channels. At level 1313 and below, information brokers are among the most consistently prosperous members of the community. Their profession requires intelligence, social skill, and extremely good memory, and the particular kind of ethical flexibility that allows a person to sell the same information to opposing parties without losing sleep. The most successful brokers are not, despite the popular image of the profession, shadowy loners in dark corners. They are, for the most part, sociable people. They need to be. Their work depends entirely on relationships, on being the kind of person that other people want to talk to, and, crucially, to confide in. They know the names of their clients' children, they remember which species prefer to eat before a meeting, and which prefer to conduct business on an empty stomach. They know who drinks too much and what it makes them say, and they file that information carefully away, not to be used cheaply, because cheap information is bad for business, but to be held in reserve for the moment when it becomes genuinely valuable. In the underworld, everyone carries something useful if you know how to ask for it. The criminal organizations proper are a different matter. Black Sun, which we have already mentioned, is the most ancient and most vertically integrated of the galaxy-spanning criminal networks. It is organized in a hierarchy that has, in different eras, been more or less rigidly enforced. At the top, a leadership structure that changes hands with some regularity and a certain amount of violence, but that maintains a consistent enough institutional culture to have persisted through all its many reorganizations. Beneath the leadership, regional leaders called Vigos oversee operations in specific territories, and beneath the Vigos, the vast, anonymous working population of an organization that, like all large organizations, runs mostly on the labor of people who have no particular personal commitment to its broader mission, but who have found that it provides a livable employment. Black Sun's presence in the Coruscant underworld is primarily financial. The organization uses the deep levels as an infrastructure for moving money, enormous amounts of money, transferred through the shadow economy in ways that avoid the financial monitoring systems of the legitimate banking sector. It also maintains a presence in certain specific trades: contraband, protection, and the management of certain transit routes through the deep levels that are not on any official map. But it would be wrong to describe the Coruscant underworld as a Black Sun territory. The underworld is not a territory in the sense that the upper city has territories, defined, mappable, and administered. It is more like a contested ecology, multiple organizations and individuals with overlapping claims and fluctuating power, held in a rough equilibrium by the constant renegotiation of mutual advantage and the threat of violence that is, most of the time, successfully not actualized. The Hoot clan maintains representatives at certain deep levels. The Pike Syndicate in the era of the late Republic has grown its influence significantly, driven particularly by its control of spice trafficking through the deep transit routes. Several smaller regional organizations hold territory in specific sectors with a tenacity born of having nowhere else to go. These are the organizations that are not large enough to operate across systems, that live or die by their control of a particular corridor, a particular cantina, a particular flow of commerce that they have spent decades cultivating. And then there are the individuals. The bounty hunters, the free operators, the beings who have, for whatever combination of reasons, found themselves in the underworld not as members of an organization, but as independent agents. They are a type that the Coruscant underworld produces in some abundance. People of exceptional practical capability who have found, through experience or temperament, that they work best alone. The Guild, the Bounty Hunters Guild, is the closest thing these individuals have to an institutional affiliation. It is a loose enough structure that membership in it provides more in the way of professional credibility and access to posted contracts than it does in the way of actual organizational support. A guild-registered bounty hunter is, in the language of the underworld, a professional. Someone who will complete a contracted job, handle the paperwork correctly, and not do anything extraneous that would create complications, as opposed to a non-registered operator who might be more capable, more dangerous, and entirely unaccountable. In the cantinas and common spaces of the deep levels, bounty hunters occupy a specific social position. They are treated with the particular combination of respect and wariness that the community extends to people whose skill set is both potentially useful and potentially dangerous. They are not disliked. Many of them are well known, even well liked in the communities where they operate regularly. But there is always a slight awareness in any conversation with a registered bounty hunter of the professional context in which that conversation is taking place, of the work they do and what it requires of them. The moral texture of the underworld is, in general, more complex than either of its two primary popular narratives would suggest. The narrative that says it is simply a place of crime and danger, a problem to be solved, or at least contained, ignores the millions of people who live there in something that, while constrained and difficult, constitutes an actual life. A life with relationships and work and humor and art and the full range of human and non-human experience that exists everywhere that beings come together. The narrative that romanticizes it as a world of pure freedom, of individuals operating outside the suffocating constraints of the upper city's rules and hierarchies, ignores the violence and exploitation and narrowed possibility that the absence of functional law actually produces. The truth of the underworld is, like most truths, both simpler and harder than either narrative. It is a place where people are trying to live, where the circumstances of that living are genuinely more difficult than they need to be, not because of anything inherent to the beings who live there, but because of the accumulated decisions of the levels above. Decisions about where to invest and where not to invest, about whose comfort and safety to prioritize and whose to treat as secondary. Where those accumulated decisions have produced, over generations, a social ecology with its own strengths and its own wounds, its own codes of conduct, and its own varieties of kindness and cruelty. At Below, the evening shift is beginning. The proprietor is reviewing the inventory with the quiet attention of someone who has been doing this for 30 years and finds it, if not exciting, genuinely satisfying. Across the bar, a Zabrak and a Mirialan are playing a card game whose rules appear to involve a level of interpersonal negotiation that blurs the line between the game and the conversation. In the corner booth that is most carefully shadowed, two beings whose faces are not visible are having a conversation in voices too quiet to carry. The city above hums on, unknowing. Below, the rhythms of a different kind of life continue. But the underworld, for all its complexity, was about to undergo a transformation more profound than any internal reorganization could produce, because the force that would change it, that would change all of Coruscant, was not coming from within. It was coming from the Senate itself, from a voice that had been very, very patient.
It happens on a day that begins like any other. The Senate is in session. The gallery is full. The 1,000 senatorial pods are deployed in their concentric rings around the central platform where the Supreme Chancellor stands. The acoustic panels in the walls are doing their ancient, patient work of carrying his voice to every corner of the chamber. The speech he gives on this day is, by later assessment, among the most extraordinary pieces of political rhetoric ever delivered in the Senate chamber. It addresses real grievances, the suffering of soldiers in a war that has gone on too long, the instability of a republic that has been weakened by years of crisis, the genuine fear that a civilization built over 25,000 years might be collapsing. The grievances are real. The suffering is real. The instability is real. This is what makes the speech so effective. It is built on truth, or on enough truth that the architecture of falsehood beneath it is hidden. When Sheev Palpatine, Supreme Chancellor, Senator from Naboo, and, in the secret architecture of his plans, the Sith Lord who has spent decades engineering the crisis that he is now presenting as a solution, declares the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire, the Senate erupts. Not in opposition, in applause. There are senators who do not applaud, a small number. They sit in their pods and watch, some with shock, some with understanding, some with the particular expression of people who had seen something coming for so long that its arrival produces not surprise, but a kind of exhausted recognition. A Naboo senator named Padme Amidala is among them. She watches the applause roll through the chamber in wave after wave, species after species, pod after pod, and says, quietly, to the colleague beside her, "So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause." But she says it quietly, and the applause is very loud. The transformation of Coruscant that follows the proclamation of the Galactic Empire is, in its first phase, remarkably swift. Within days, the symbolic changes are already underway. The Republic's insignia, the sunburst pattern that has been everywhere in the Senate district, inlaid into the floors and carved into the lintels and stitched into the flags, begins to be replaced. A new symbol emerges, the imperial crest, a design that is deliberately simpler and more rigid than what it replaced, more like a machine part than a living thing. The Senate building is temporarily closed for what is officially described as security review and procedural restructuring. During this closure, which lasts several weeks, certain senators receive formal notification that their credentials have been suspended pending investigation. Others receive no notification at all, but when they attempt to return to the building, find that their access codes no longer function. The capital is renamed. Coruscant, Galactic City, becomes simply Imperial Center. The name Coruscant does not officially disappear. It is still the planet's designation on navigational charts and official communications, but in common Imperial usage, in official Imperial documents, in the signage that begins appearing on government buildings across the Senate District, it is Imperial Center. It is the center of the Emperor's domain. In the first months of the Empire, Imperial Center is still recognizable as the Coruscant it was. The buildings are the same buildings. The streets are the same streets. The cantinas in the Underworld are still serving the same customers. The traffic flows have not changed. The great infrastructure of the city, its power systems, its water recycling, its climate control, continues to function exactly as it always has, because it was always maintained by people whose work had nothing to do with political systems and who continued to show up for their shifts under the Empire as they did under the Republic. But certain things change quickly. The Jedi Temple changes. In the days after the proclamation, clone troopers march on the temple under orders from a commander who was, until very recently, the Jedi Order's most trusted and most capable commander. The attack on the temple, which will be described in Imperial documentation as a response to a Jedi uprising, a framing that subsequent historians will dispute vigorously, was swift and, in the most purely military sense, effective. The Jedi, as an institution, had not been designed for this kind of attack. They were peacekeepers, diplomats, individuals of great skill in individual confrontation and small unit operations. They were not an army. Their temple was not a fortress. The architecture that we walked through in an earlier chapter, those wide corridors, that open space, that philosophy of openness expressed in the empty center of the entrance hall, was designed for a world in which the temple's fundamental security was not a serious concern. In the days that follow, the temple burns. Not entirely, not structurally. The fires are controlled, aimed at specific targets. The archives, in part, the Jedi Council, certain records rooms. What burns in the Jedi Temple is, primarily, information. The deliberate destruction of information. The removal from the historical record of things that the new order does not want recorded. When the fires are out, the temple is still standing. The 5 towers still rise above the Senate district, but they are silent now.
their windows dark. The pale stone of the exterior, so carefully chosen across those 4,000 years of construction, is marked in places by the evidence of recent violence. Scorch marks, blast damage, the hasty patching of entry points forced by soldiers who did not know or care about the architecture they were moving through. The building is eventually repurposed. The Emperor is practical about real estate, especially in the most symbolically valuable district of his capital. The Jedi Temple becomes a palace, Imperial Palace, the Emperor's residence on Coruscant, the center of his personal administration. The transformation is thorough and expensive, and as an act of symbolic violence, extraordinarily eloquent. The building that housed the Republic's most ancient guardians becomes the private home of the man who destroyed them. The 5 towers remain, but they are lit now in the cold white light of the Imperial aesthetic, a light that conveys efficiency and control rather than the amber warmth of the archives or the indirect contemplative glow of the meditation chambers. The gardens behind the temple are redesigned. The training courts are removed. The great open spaces that characterize the Jedi approach to physical space, the empty centers, the held open areas, are filled in with the structures of Imperial administration because the Empire, unlike the Jedi, does not believe in empty centers. The Empire believes in filling everything up. The Senate continues to meet. This surprises some observers. There is a faction of newly minted imperial theorists who advocate for the immediate dissolution of the Senate as a legacy of the Republic's failed governance model. But Palpatine is more patient than that and more sophisticated. The Senate in the early Empire is still useful. It provides the appearance of a continuing civic process. It gives the 1,000-plus member worlds a forum for bringing their complaints and competing for imperial favor, and it keeps a large, potentially restive population of political beings occupied in the elaborate rituals of Senate procedure, while the actual governance of the Empire is conducted elsewhere, in offices and communications that the Senate's official channels do not access. The Senate is, in the early Empire, a theater, a very grand, very old theater with extraordinary acoustics and 1,000 years of polished floors and the most beautiful building in the known galaxy for its stage, but theater nonetheless. In the Underworld, the change of regime is absorbed with a certain pragmatic equanimity. The criminal organizations adjust, as they always adjust. Black Sun, which had already been cultivating relationships with elements of what would become the Imperial administration during the Clone Wars, finds the transition relatively smooth. New contacts to establish, new arrangements to negotiate, the same fundamental commercial logic applying to the new system as to the old. The smaller organizations that had depended heavily on the relative laxness of Republic enforcement in the deep levels discover that Imperial enforcement, at least initially, is not significantly more attentive to the Underworld. The Empire's priorities are the systems, the populations, the economic outputs that matter at the galactic scale. The deep levels of Imperial Center remain, as they have always been, largely beyond the attention of the authority above. For the ordinary residents of the deep levels, the transition is felt primarily in 2 ways. The first is economic. The disruption of the Clone Wars economy and the immediate post-proclamation period of uncertainty produces instability in the informal markets that the Underworld depends on, some increase in prices, some contraction of availability. This stabilizes within a year as the Empire establishes its economic priorities and the effects work their way down to the deep levels. The second is atmospheric. The Empire changes the quality of the fear in the city. Under the Republic, the fear in the Underworld was primarily local, specific organizations, specific individuals, specific grievances and debts and territorial disputes. Under the Empire, a new type of fear was added. A larger, more abstract fear, the fear of a state that has demonstrated clearly and recently its willingness to use violence at scale and its lack of interest in the procedural constraints that had, however imperfectly, limited the Republic's use of power. This fear does not come to the deep levels in dramatic form, not in the early years of the Empire as stormtrooper patrols or raids or direct confrontation. It comes as information, as the news filtering down through the levels of what has happened to the Jedi, of what is happening on worlds that have resisted Imperial integration, of the growing network of ISB agents whose function is specifically to track and report on dissent. It comes as awareness, as the knowledge that the rules have changed in ways that cannot yet be fully mapped. And in the Underworld, where the capacity for surviving changed rules is a core survival skill, people begin quietly to adapt. But adaptation is not the same as acceptance, and the Empire, for all its power and all its patience, had planted within itself the very forces that one day would pull it apart. That ending was still years away, but the seeds of it were already in the ground, in the Underworld, in the deep levels, in the places where the city's memory lived on despite everything that had been done to silence it.
19 years. That is the duration of what history will come to call the Imperial period of Coruscant. 19 years from the proclamation of the Empire to the Battle of Endor, and the beginning of the Empire's end. 19 years is not, by the standards of Coruscant's long history, a very long time. It is not even long in human terms, barely a generation. Many of the people who had been alive and adult when the Republic fell were still alive and adult when the Empire began to collapse. They could remember what had come before. They carried the comparison in their bodies, in the accumulated texture of daily experience. But 19 years lived under a particular kind of governance can change a city in ways that are difficult to fully catalog. What the Empire did to Coruscant in those 19 years was less a dramatic transformation and more a gradual tightening, a progressive reduction of possibility, so slow in its accumulation that any given day of it felt nearly bearable, while the distance between the first day and the last was enormous. In the upper city, in the government district, the imperial aesthetic settled in with the decisiveness of an occupying force certain of its permanence. The Republic's organic complexity, the 1,000 competing architectural styles, the flags of 100 systems, the audible multilingualism of the Senate District's plazas, was progressively streamlined. The Empire preferred coherence. It preferred the impression of a single intentional will expressed in every surface and every sign and every uniform. The plazas were cleaned of their informal vendors. The signage became uniform. The languages that appeared in official public communication narrowed to basic, with other languages appearing only in designated contexts. The effect was, and imperial aestheticians would have considered this a success, impressive. Imperial Center, from the upper levels, looked like the capital of an empire. It had the quality of something that had always been this way, that could not be otherwise, that was as natural as the force of gravity, which was, of course, precisely the intention. In the mid-levels, the changes were less visible, but in some ways more consequential. The Empire invested heavily in certain infrastructure improvements, transit systems serving the industrial sectors, power grid upgrades in areas supporting manufacturing output that the Empire required. These improvements were real and were genuinely beneficial to the people in those areas. The Empire was not, as a practical matter, indifferent to the basic functioning of its capital's middle layers. A city that produced efficiently was worth maintaining. What the Empire did not invest in were the informal support systems, the social infrastructure that had been patchily maintained under the Republic, the community centers, the free clinics, the educational facilities that had served the lower-income populations of the mid-levels. These were not dramatically shut down, they were simply underfunded, then underfunded further, then quietly removed from the budget lines without announcement, relying on the fact that by the time they disappeared completely, enough time had passed since they were last funded that their absence would seem like a fact of life rather than a decision. In the Underworld, the Empire maintained a policy of strategic neglect combined with selective intervention. The selective interventions were harsh and visible. When an example needed to be made, when some activity in the deep levels threatened imperial supply chains or created instability in a sector the Empire considered strategically important, the response was efficient and disproportionate.
ISB agents working undercover in the Underworld communities became increasingly common in the middle years of the Empire. The information they gathered was used not primarily to address crime in the deep levels was not a priority, but to identify and remove potential sources of organized resistance. The word rebel acquired a new weight in those years. Under the Republic, resistance to the government was categorized in various ways: political opposition, civil disobedience, criminal activity, and responded to with varying degrees of force, usually bounded by some procedural framework. Under the Empire, the category of rebellion was both broader and more uniformly addressed. Being a rebel, or being credibly suspected of being a rebel, or being associated with someone credibly suspected of being a rebel, put a person in a specific danger that had no equivalent under the previous system. In the deep levels, this produced a careful new grammar of conversation. Topics that had been discussed openly, political dissatisfaction, critique of the government, memory of the Republic, became topics to approach obliquely in trusted company, with attention paid to who might be listening. The cantina culture of the Underworld, which had always had its codes and its silences, developed new codes and new silences. And underneath the codes, something else was developing, slowly, carefully, the way things develop in places where direct action is impossible and the only mode available is patience, the beginnings of organized resistance.
The Rebel Alliance, the network of individuals and organizations that eventually coalesced into the military force that fought the Galactic Civil War, had roots everywhere in the galaxy. On Coruscant, those roots went deep. Into the Underworld, where the Empire's information network had gaps it did not fully know about. Into the mid-levels, where people who had lost something under the Empire, careers, communities, family members, found each other and held on to the idea that what had been lost might someday be recovered. The Battle of Endor, when it came, was not a battle that took place on Coruscant. It took place on a moon at the edge of the galaxy, around a weapon of such scale and purpose that its destruction, when it happened, sent a shockwave of disbelief through the entire Imperial apparatus. The Emperor was dead. The second Death Star was gone. The military command structure of the Empire was fractured, suddenly, and without the prepared succession that a more cautious administration would have arranged. On Coruscant, the news of Endor arrived first as rumor, then as fragmentary holonet reports, inconsistent and contradictory, then as something more solid, not quite official confirmation, because the Empire's communication systems were, in those first chaotic hours, struggling with the question of what to confirm and how, but solid enough that the people of the city, all through its levels from the highest tower to the deepest corridor, began to understand that something had changed. What happened in the streets of Imperial Center in the hours after Endor's news became clear was a complicated thing that resists simple description. In the upper levels, the Imperial government quarter went into a kind of controlled shutdown. Lights stayed on, guards remained at their posts, but the quality of the presence changed. The guards standing at Senate entrances and government ministry doors were visibly doing something different from what they had been doing the day before. They were waiting for orders that were slow in coming, from a command structure that was working through its own shock, for the shape of the next thing, which none of them had anticipated and for which they had no prepared instructions. In the mid-levels, people came out of doors they had been keeping closed. In the Underworld, there was a different kind of change, a loosening. The specific quality of constraint that ISB surveillance had produced, the careful grammar of conversation, the strategic silences began in those first hours after Endor to relax. Not completely, not immediately. The ISB still existed, the Empire still existed, but the fear that had given those institutions their weight had become suddenly a weight that the future was not necessarily required to carry. In the cantina at level 1313 below, the establishment that has been serving its clientele for 800 years under 7 different political systems, the proprietor serves a round of drinks to the dozen or so beings who have come together around the holonet display. He says nothing. None of them say much.
They watch the reports come in and go out and contradict each other and gradually, imperfectly, form a picture. When the round is finished, he pours another. Nobody has asked. He has been doing this long enough to know when people need another drink without being asked. The process of actually liberating Coruscant, of transitioning from Imperial authority to New Republic governance, takes considerably longer than Endor and is considerably less clean. The Empire fragments rather than surrendering, and its various component commanders make separate decisions about whether and when to yield. On Coruscant specifically, the final transition of governmental authority involves nearly a year of negotiation, partial ceasefires, the maneuvering of multiple New Republic fleets, and the political management of a population of several trillion whose experiences of the transition vary enormously depending on their level in the city. The Senate building, which has been operating as a carefully constrained imperial legislative body for 19 years, reopens under New Republic administration with a ceremony that is, consciously, both a beginning and a statement of continuity. The banners in the entrance hall are changed. The insignia on the floors is covered temporarily and later replaced. The name changes back. Imperial Center becomes Coruscant again, Galactic City again. It is, in many ways, a physical act of memory, a return of the city to a name it has not officially held for 19 years, an assertion that the name remembered before the Empire is the name that will persist. But memory in a city this old is always more complicated than a name change, because beneath the name, beneath the politics, beneath the Republic and the Empire and the New Republic and all the other structures that have claimed Coruscant as their own across the centuries, there is something older, something that predates all of those claims, something that has been waiting in the dark at the very bottom of the city since before the first tower was built. And it is that oldest thing that our final chapter belongs to.
We have been descending, all through this long night together, in our patient journey through the layers of Coruscant's history. We have been moving downward, from the Senate dome in the morning light, down through the committee rooms in the gilded halls, down through the Jedi Temple's amber archives and the amber-lit corridors of the mid-levels, down through level 1313 and into the Underworld, down through the long night of the Empire and the uncertain dawn that followed it. Now let us go all the way down, to the place where the descent ends. It is difficult to travel to the planet's original surface. Not technically impossible, expeditions have been mounted by the scholars and the explorers and the simply curious across the centuries, but practically very difficult, and in many places genuinely dangerous, because the journey requires passing through levels of the city that have been abandoned and sealed and partially collapsed and sealed again over so many years that the architecture has become an obstacle course rather than a navigable space. The deepest levels with any significant human presence, that is, levels that are regularly occupied and navigated by living beings rather than merely accessible to them in principle, extend down to perhaps level 5000 in the standard Coruscant numbering system. Below that, the occupation becomes increasingly sparse and the architecture increasingly uncertain. The power systems still function. The city's power grid runs its cables through even these lowest levels because the generators that produce Coruscant's energy are built into the deepest structural layers, and their power must travel upward to reach the inhabited city. But the lighting becomes rudimentary. The structural maintenance has not been performed in decades, or in some places centuries. The floors are covered in the accumulated sediment of a city overhead, dust and corrosion products, and the slow chemical weathering of materials that were not designed to last this long without attention. Below level 5000, even this sparse occupation disappears. The levels below are sealed, not by any continuous single act of sealing, but by the cumulative effect of individual decisions made over hundreds of years. Collapse events that were contained rather than repaired, areas declared hazardous and closed off, sections of the city that the maintenance budget never reached and eventually stopped attempting to reach. The sealed levels are not empty. They are full of the city's own deep infrastructure, the old bones of Coruscant, the structural elements that have been bearing the weight of everything above them for so long that they have become functionally geological.
And within those sealed levels, and deeper still, in the space that those structural layers enclose, there is something that the scholar we met in Chapter 6 spent 20 years trying to understand: the remains of Coruscant's natural world. Not extensive remains, not a lost paradise, not an intact ecosystem waiting to be rediscovered. The natural world of the original planet was, as we established at the beginning of this journey, thoroughly and irreversibly built over thousands of years ago. What survived is fragments, traces, the kind of evidence that you have to know how to read and have to be prepared to find in unexpected forms. In one area that the scholar was able to access, a pocket within the sealed deep levels, reachable through a series of maintenance conduits that had been documented but not visited in over 2 centuries, she found a space approximately 30 meters across and 10 meters high, formed by the accidental convergence of several structural elements into a kind of vault. In this vault, which was sealed against the rest of the deep level by the same accidental convergence that had created it, there was air, real air, or something close to it, air that had been cycling within this sealed space for so long that it had developed its own microchemistry, distinct from the recycled, filtered air of the city above. And in this air, growing on the walls and on the floor in the places where some minimal moisture had accumulated over the long years, there were organisms. Not plants, not in any form that would be recognizable as the forests that once covered this world, but biological material, resistant, minimal organisms of the kind that persist in extreme enough to have eliminated everything else. Organisms that were, by the genetic analysis the scholar was able to conduct, related very distantly, very barely, through a chain of evolutionary descent almost too long to trace, to the plants of the original Coruscant surface. When the results of this analysis came back, the scholar sat alone in her university office for a long time. She had spent 20 years working toward this. She had hypothesized that something might have survived, somewhere, in some form. She had argued for its likelihood in papers that most of her colleagues had found interesting but not compelling, and now she had the evidence. And what she felt, sitting in her office with the data on the screen in front of her, was not triumph. It was something quieter and harder to name, something that had to do with the particular emotion that is produced by discovering that something you were not sure had survived, had in fact survived, against everything, in the dark, for a long time. The city had not killed its own past completely. Somewhere, impossibly deep, impossibly diminished, the original world was still alive. What this means philosophically and practically is a question that different people answer differently. For the scholar, it is first and foremost a scientific finding, documentation of biological survival in an extreme environment, with implications for understanding how life persists through radical habitat change. For others, and the finding does when it eventually becomes public through a paper in a journal read by considerably more than 40 people, a wider audience, it carries a different weight. There is a tradition in many cultures of the buried seed, the idea that what is buried is not necessarily destroyed, that it persists, reduced and dark and patient, waiting for some future condition in which it might grow again. This tradition has its origin in observed natural fact. Seeds do survive burial, sometimes for very long periods, and do germinate when conditions change. But it has acquired, in all the cultures that hold it, a meaning beyond its agricultural origin. It has become a way of speaking about possibility, about the persistence of something essential through conditions that appear to have eliminated it. Coruscant has been burying its own past for 25,000 years. The oceans, the rivers, the forests, the original rock. Civilization after civilization built one on top of the other, each one pressing the previous one deeper into a layer of darkness and forgetting. And at the very bottom of all of that burying, in a sealed vault 30 meters across, in the form of something that barely resembles what it descended from, the original world has kept something alive. As you rest here tonight, imagine, if you can, descending all the way, past the Senate halls and the Jedi Temple and the amber-lit corridors and the cantina and the sealed levels and the ancient structural bones of the city, down through layers of compressed civilization, through the records of 10,000 years of decision-making, through the strata of materials and alloys and architectural styles and political systems, all the way down to that small vault of preserved air, to the tiny organisms on the walls, to the last thread of connection to the world this city used to be. It is very quiet down there, quieter than anywhere else in the city, quieter than the sealed levels, quieter than the archives, quieter even than the meditation chambers of the Jedi Temple. The sound of the city above does not reach here. No infrastructure vibration, no traffic, no power system pulse, just silence. Real silence, or as close to it as exists on a world that has been inhabited for so long. And in that silence, something is still growing. This is perhaps the most important thing to know about Coruscant. Not its political history, though that history is vast and instructive. Not its architecture, though the city's architecture is among the most extraordinary achievements in the galaxy. Not its population, though the trillion souls who have made their lives in its levels represent an extraordinary concentration of the variety and possibility of sentient life. The most important thing about Coruscant is that it never managed to entirely erase what it was before, that underneath all the accumulated weight of ambition and history and civilization and politics and war, the original world persists, reduced, transformed, barely recognizable, but alive. Cities, all cities, not just Coruscant, have this quality if you look for it. They are always built on something older than themselves. The things they are built on are rarely as thoroughly buried as Coruscant's original surface, but they are there, in the bedrock, in the river that was diverted underground, in the tree root growing through the foundation, in the memory that the streets were once something else and might be something else again. What Coruscant teaches, what its extraordinary, impossible, beautiful, terrible history teaches, is that nothing is so thoroughly buried that it becomes nothing, that the layers of civilization, pressed down by the weight of the next, do not disappear. They become the foundation of the future. They become the ground on which the next thing is built. And somewhere in there, in the deepest layers, the original thing, the thing that was before all of it, waits in the dark with the patience of something that has learned to survive without sun. The city breathes above it, Senate and Empire and New Republic and the 1,000 administrations that came before and will come after, all cycling through their histories with the urgency of things that believe themselves to be permanent. And beneath them all, the small organisms in their sealed vault breathe their own quiet cycles with no knowledge of any of it, asking for nothing except to continue. This, in the end, is the story of Coruscant, not the story of any particular government or any particular war, not even the story of the Force, though the Force has played its part here. The story of a world that built and built and built until it had built itself into something that could no longer see its own ground, and then kept building because that was what it knew how to do. And in the depths of all that building, in the darkness it had created by covering everything, the original world persisted. As you rest here tonight, wherever you are, in the comfort of your own evening and your own quiet space, let that image be the last one. Not the towers of the Senate, though they were magnificent, not the fires at the Jedi Temple, though they changed the world, but the sealed vault 30 meters across, in the deepest level of the deepest city in the galaxy, the small organisms on the walls, the old air cycling its slow cycles, the silence. Something is always growing in the dark. It takes longer than we expect, and it asks for less than we assume, and it does not announce itself with fanfares or proclamations, but it is there, under everything, patient as stone, patient as the original ground, patient as what was here before the city began, and patient as what will be here in some form, in some thread of continuity too fine to see, when the last light of the last tower finally fades.
And so, dear traveler, our journey through the layers of Coruscant comes to its gentle end. We have walked the gleaming corridors of the Senate. We have stood in the amber light of the Jedi archives and felt the weight of 10,000 years of careful knowledge. We have descended through the mid-levels, through level 1313, through the amber and shadow world of the Underworld and all its complicated lives. We have watched empires rise and fall, and watched the city absorb each change the way deep water absorbs a stone, with a brief disturbance on the surface, and then the long, patient settling back towards stillness. And we have found, at the very bottom, the thing that all that history was resting on, the small, improbable, extraordinary persistence of the original world. You have been wonderful company on this journey. Your presence, your listening, your willingness to descend through all those layers and come safely back to the surface. This is what makes the journey worth taking. Let the hum of the city fade now. Let the Senate halls empty and the temple go quiet, and the deep levels rest in their old silence. Let even the smallest organisms in their sealed vault rest, patient and unhurried, in the dark they have made their home. Let the weight of this world, this extraordinary, impossible, beautiful city planet, be light now. Let it settle around you like a blanket rather than a burden. Let the 25,000 years of history breathe softly around you as you drift. You have seen the whole of it tonight, the height of it and the depth, the light and the long, quiet dark underneath. And now the dark is friendly, and the quiet is deep. And the city, all of it, all the way down to the very last layer, is at rest. And so, as the echoes of the past fade into silence, and the towers of Coruscant grow dim in the long night of the galaxy, may you drift now into a calm and deep and restful sleep. Until next time on Pastscapes, your place for calming journeys into the past.